I know a lie when I hear one, because as Prime Minister of this country, one gets to hear a great number of them.
Tonight, Channel 4 embarks on a unique televisual expedition into the world of the Scott Report.
It is a story about British government today, secrecy, deception and cover-up.
Highlighting the good, the bad and the uninformed.
In addition to promotions or knighthoods, they'll receive their own Scott Award.
Rory Bremner, Sheena McDonald in Scott of the Arms Antics, tonight at 10 on Channel 4.
Wild Britons look at the...
Hello. What you're about to see, some of you may find rather disturbing. I can assure you I find it very disturbing indeed. Oh yes. And I should know I was part of it, or rather, I wasn't, which, if I may say so, is rather the point. Tonight's programme concerns British policy regarding the Middle East from the mid-1980s to the end of the Gulf War and beyond. That conflict, I need hardly remind you, saw the country's finest young men armed with some of the most sophisticated weapons this country has ever produced. And that was just on their side. The question is, whether guidelines restricting British arms exports were altered without the knowledge or consent of Parliament. It's all lies. Let me tell you, I know a lie when I hear one, because as Prime Minister of this country, one gets to hear a great number of them. Huge lies. Whoppers. Lies that would make your hair stand on end. During the course of the evening, you will, I have no doubt, hear a lot of smart people systematically distorting the truth, misleading you about what the government did, and rewriting events to suit their own narrow political ends. We have a name for these people. We call them junior ministers. There has been considerable speculation, tittle-tattle, that I knew what was going on. Let me make one thing plain. To imply that because I held the positions of Foreign Secretary, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Prime Minister, I was in some way aware of government policy is scurrilous beyond belief. Indeed, I said as much to Lord Justice Scott. Oh yes, I was quite particular on that particular point. Particularly so, in fact. No, it shows a lamentable ignorance of the way that government works. Government is difficult. To govern Britain as we have done for 16 years takes a lot of nerve. It isn't easy. And I want to ask you to do something rather difficult for me. I want you to believe that when we say we were not aware of a change in policy, that that is indeed the case. And if you hear anyone questioning our integrity, I want you to close your eyes, put your fingers in your ears, and hum a tuneless tune. Confronted with all these scandalous allegations, you must take a firm stand and simply deny any knowledge of it. Believe me, I've been doing it for 6 years. It's worked for me. La 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 la.
Yes, after 3.5 years, the report that everyone is trying not to talk about is finally ready to roll off the presses. 200,000 pages of documents. No wonder his lordship, or should that be his wordship, is so confused. But don't worry, because this Lord Justice is definitely not being taken for a ride by anyone in his relentless search for the truth. Our boys from Matrix Churchill, the brave British bombers, faced the rigours of British justice. But truth prevailed, and they were all let off scot-free. So it's no wonder they're celebrating. But not everyone seems so happy. Chin up for the cameras, fellas. No, not today. They've remembered that one man's arms trial acquittal is another man's arms trade inquiry. And the outcome? Well, he may be jumping to conclusions, but we're certainly not. Instead, we'll just say, hats off to plucky Lord Justice Scott and his men. And lady men. And thanks for a job well done. That's right. On your bike, your lordship, and thanks for the memory. Because now, if you don't mind, we'll take over as we set off in search of the true story of Scott of the Arms Antics.
This is not fundamentally a story about guns. It is a story about British government today. It's about secrecy, deception and cover-up. It's about the customary and characteristic behaviour of senior government ministers and the civil servants who advise them. And so it's about us, what we know, what we believe, and how we play our parts in a parliamentary democracy. And it's a story about the government's willingness to see 3 men jailed for crimes which, they claimed in their defence, were committed with the approval of the British government. Only when the Matrix Churchill trial collapsed in November 1992 was the true nature of how Britain is governed exposed. The following day, Lord Justice Scott was appointed to investigate how it was possible for so many arms to be exported to Iraq despite government rules preventing such exports, to find out what ministers and civil servants knew about it, and to unwrap the layers of confusion clouding the collapse of the Matrix Churchill trial. His report is due. It's expected to be explosive, and tonight we show why. With the help of actors and using the transcripts of the inquiry itself, we'll hear the evidence given by ministers and civil servants who were questioned by Scott and his counsel, Presiley Baxendale. Whatever else you learn, you will hear how that evidence demonstrated the flexibility of the English language. And there was something here for everyone. For the linguistic purist, junior Foreign Office Minister Tristan Garel-Jones.
Unquantifiable could hardly be read as anything other than unquantifiably large.
I disagree entirely. I specifically take it to mean unquantifiably large or unquantifiably small.
For the moral absolutist, the concept of truth was explored. Head of the Civil Service, Sir Robin Butler, was clear.
Half the picture. Half the picture can be true.
Lower-ranking civil servant Ian McDonald was less clear.
Truth is a very difficult concept.
While Prime Minister John Major demonstrated his own brand of clarity.
Something that I was not aware had happened suddenly turned out not to have happened.
But how else are we to encapsulate in some 100-odd minutes what took Richard Scott over 3 years? First, a dash of dramatic license has procured us the assistance of 2 high-ranking, influential and hitherto completely unknown civil servants.
Our role as civil servants is to ensure that Lord Justice Scott is totally free and untrammelled to reach whatever conclusion he deems fit.
Now, just so long as that conclusion's in line with the view which the government want him to take.
Oh, absolutely. The role of an inquiry like this is quite simple. It is to reassure the public that the government they elected is behaving itself.
Ha! Can you imagine the trauma the man in the street would suffer if he thought he'd misjudged the people he'd voted for? He'd be devastated.
It's not Scott's right to ask awkward questions that I object to. No, what I object to is his self-assumed right to insist that we have to answer those same questions.
Journalist Paul Foote is here. He followed the Scott inquiry's progress from beginning to end.
I'll be looking at 1 or 2 stories which come out of the Scott inquiry and which ask the question, who runs the country? Is it run, as most people believe, by elected ministers on behalf of all the people, or is it run by unelected civil servants and unelected directors of big companies, in this case, arms companies?
And we're assisted by one of those invaluable front men who decode national events like this in their not quite inimitable style.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. Are you sitting comfortably? Then you're obviously not a junior minister with an itchy conscience. Right, now during the course of this evening, I'll be keeping you up to speed on some of the key characters. There they are, on your screen. These are the guys we're going to criticise. The names in the frames include Robin Butler, Nicholas Ridley, William Waldegrave, Alan Clark, Lord Trefgarne, Tristan Garel-Jones, crazy name, crazy guy, Patrick Mayhew, John Major, and last but not third, my Aunt Jemima. Towards the end of the programme, back to September, our special Scottometer will analyse the progress of the inquiry and show the results directly on the screen. So if we roll the graphic, watch those faces. There we go. That's all it is. Now, no one goes away empty-handed, because in addition to promotions or knighthoods, they'll receive their own Scott Award for outstanding services to standing outside. And here it is. But less of that later. Those are the general guidelines, but we are prepared to be flexible about how we interpret them, but that flexibility will be rigorously implemented. In other words, we reserve the right at any stage to change the rules, adopt a more liberal policy, or disregard the guidelines altogether, so long as we don't tell you, which is what it's all about. Sheena.
Lord Justice Scott's investigation is unique in British politics and history. Never before has anyone had the power to call whoever he wanted, look at whatever documents he wanted, and to conduct all this in public. Never again, it said, will such license be granted. There was one figure who dominated British politics for much of the period covered by the inquiry. To be interrogated by Presiley Baxendale was a new experience for Margaret Thatcher.
The precise question is, Miss Baxendale, I am sorry you're more familiar with this. I have seen so much paper I've never seen before. Is there more paper?
That's only part of it. There's much more.
It's in the nature of this inquiry that we've had to look at huge amounts of paper, I'm afraid. We'll try to bore you with as little as possible.
Which page?
What I wanted to ask you about were the comments on page 29.
Mr. Baxendale, I did not see this document at the time. If I had seen every copy of every memo, I should have been in a snowstorm.
I don't suggest you did see it.
I was concerned with the policy. I could not possibly have been involved in these things. I could not have done my job as Prime Minister on policy if I had been involved in these things. And I do not, with respect, think it right that I should now comment on a document which I have never seen. It is very difficult, my lord. I did not see most of these documents at the time, nor could I possibly have seen them.
The purpose of putting some of these notes to you is not because there is an expectation that you might have seen them at the time, but you have unparalleled experience in government, and it was thought that that might be of assistance. I don't think Miss Baxendale has actually asked the question. Could you leave it to ask it? And then see whether you might be able to help me with an answer to it.
The background to the Scott inquiry is well known. On the 22nd of September 1980, Saddam Hussein launched his attack on Iran, unleashing the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. This put the British government in a dilemma. The war was horrifyingly bloody, bringing back memories of the trench warfare of the First World War, as waves and waves of soldiers, often alarmingly young, were sent to certain death. In public, the British government had to deplore it and banned the sale of lethal equipment to either side. But this policy was not straightforward, as we shall see.
So what you're saying is we have a problem?
There is a problem, yes. You see, under the present terms, we cannot sell arms directly to Iran with a war in progress.
We can't?
No.
No. No. No, of course not, no. Why not?
They might win and destabilize oil supplies. Besides, our Arab friends would hardly take kindly to our supplying their chap's sworn enemy. Not that any of them support Iraq either, but better devil you know, so to speak.
Supply the other side?
Iraq?
Yeah, those chaps, yes.
No can do either. Foreign Office pressure. They reckon Iran might win, and we wouldn't want our relations with them to be damaged by having supported the Iraqis. Rather hoping to patch up our differences if it goes that way.
So don't supply either side?
And put our arms industry on the skids. There are British jobs at stake. No, this is serious. There are contracts outstanding. Cancel them, and the government will have to pay out a fortune in guarantees.
Well, there must be a solution.
There is. We supply both sides.
Forgive me, then, but I fail to see your problem.
Well, now we come to the awkward bit. You see, the government has stated publicly that it will not sell lethal weapons to either side. Neutrality business, taking sides is dangerous.
Yeah, so what we're looking for here is a form of guideline that allows you to carry on exporting merrily while all the time reassuring the general public we're not supplying the war in any way.
Exactly. Something that helps reinforce our present position by appearing anti-export, but which could, if necessary, be interpreted as pro-export. With that, you see, we could really go places.
Let me suggest that you start by directing your chosen words to the future. It's always good to be forward-looking rather than backward.
Well, how about something like, we should not approve orders in future for any defence equipment?
Yeah, that's good. A touch of ambiguity, perhaps. I always find a splash of subjectivity a tonic when drafting the undraftable.
In our view?
Excellent. Admirable choice. Reasoned, fair, totally lacking in definition. And to complement that, we should finish with a description of the banned items that while ringing the necessary positive note of vigilance, allows us to exclude absolutely anything we fancy.
Which, in our view, would significantly enhance the capability of either side to prolong or exacerbate the conflict.
Perfect. Perfect. Who is going to be able to decide whether that is indeed the case, other than a government minister? So the government decides what to do, and the government decides if it was right to do what it has decided to do on the basis that it alone is best qualified to decide whether it will cause the course of action it expects or not.
The guidelines were introduced, although not announced, in 1984. A succession of witnesses were to tell Sir Richard Scott what they thought of the guidelines. Alan Clark, Minister of State for Trade and then Defence, who was gung-ho for arms sales so long as they made money for Britain without killing any British subjects, despised them.
At the bottom of page 4, you compare the guidelines to a Cheshire cat. And then you go on to say, they were high-sounding, combining, it seemed, both moral and practical considerations, and yet imprecise enough to allow real policy considerations to override them in exceptional circumstances.
Yes. They illustrate, and this is the kind of thing you can say about them, the constructive tension between positivism and ambiguity. A doctoral thesis, Professor Eyre. The whole of Guideline 3 is a brilliant piece of drafting, because far from being restrictive, it is open to argument in practically every one of its elements.
The guidelines were drawn up to aid public understanding of government policy, but they were in use for nearly a year before they were announced by Foreign Secretary Sir Geoffrey Howe, now Lord Howe, in 1985. They had been allowed to trickle out. But whether or not they represented a new policy was a question that ran throughout the Scott inquiry. In his written evidence to Sir Richard Scott, Sir Geoffrey Howe insisted there was no new policy, only a new presentation. At the inquiry, Presley Baxendale probed his argument.
Lord Howe, I would like to look at your written statement which you sent us. The guidelines set out in the minute did not constitute the government's policy on exports to Iraq. I'm not quite sure what the point is you're making there.
They constitute, as I say, a worthwhile improvement on our policy, which would be restrictive but nevertheless flexible.
Surely something that's a worthwhile improvement on our policy is also a statement of that.
No, it's a presentation of the policy. The policy involves a whole consideration of all the accumulated factors that are taken into consideration the whole time.
The purpose of formulating the guidelines, as I understood it, was to provide for the benefit of the officials who had to administer the policy a statement of what the desired government approach would be.
Yes, of course.
Is that not properly described as the policy?
With respect, Miss Baxendale, we can't go over the same ground again and again and again.
It's no good saying that we can't go over the same ground again and again and again.
There were a number of arguments between Baxendale and Howe, notably when the questioning moved on to 1988. The end of the war between Iran and Iraq had created a new problem. Howe had publicly condemned Saddam Hussein for gassing thousands of his own Kurdish population at the massacre at Halabja, but he was also keen to help British industry get back to selling arms. He tackled the problem in his paper, The Economic Consequences of Peace in the Gulf, which he sent to Thatcher in August 1988.
I have gone to page 106, paragraph 20, and it is saying that the defence sales policy would need to be reviewed.
Yes, paragraph 20, the first sentence says, in the post-conflict era, the opportunities for sales of defence equipment to Iran and Iraq will be considerable. On defence sales, we can use discretion on a growing number of categories as peace takes hold.
Then can we go to page 141? It refers to you being reluctant to initiate a process whereby it would become known that our line on arms sales to Iraq was being relaxed while the Kurds' chemical warfare question was still hanging over us. It could look very cynical if so soon after expressing outrage over the Iraqi treatment of the Kurds, we were to adopt a more flexible approach on arms sales.
Yes, I think what I'm saying here is clearly that there is concern about the Kurds and chemical warfare. Do not let us stir it by publicly advancing
You're
our
saying
own
that
commercial...
this approach, which you recommended for reasons put forward in the paper, would appear to the public very cynical.
Yes.
Yet you don't think it would have been very cynical?
Well, I don't think so, no. The fact is that Any attempt to enhance a commercial position is capable of being criticized by others. The only thing we can do as far as chemical attacks on the Kurds are concerned is to withhold equipment of a chemical warfare kind.
Can this not be explained to the public in a manner which the public can understand?
Not easily, no, not if you visualize the extremely emotional way in which such debates are conducted in public.
It's a sort of government knows best approach, isn't it?
Yes.
There's a clear recognition in the memoranda that the government had to take account of the feeling of the public outrage that had been aroused when the gassing of the Kurdish villages, the news of it came through.
Yes.
On the other hand, the government, having decided that now was the time to relax restrictions on defence sales to Iraq, that should be allowed to go ahead. Although, if the public had known about it, the outcry might have been sufficiently strong to cause the government to change its mind. Was that the sort of thinking behind the memoranda that we've been looking at?
It was an aspect of the outcry. Plus, there were reverberations around the world. What I'm saying is that decisions taken by government were not decisions being taken to cover up some corrupt device. They were all being taken in the context of expanding British commercial activity.
Expanding British commercial activity. What he meant by that was expanding arms sales abroad by British companies. And this is a good time to take a look at the very close relationship which has built up in recent years between British arms manufacturers and the British government. Again and again at the Scott inquiry, the names of big arms manufacturers who didn't even give evidence to the inquiry seemed to merge with names of civil servants at the Ministry of Defence. It was almost as though there was a revolving door at the ministry, through which the big men in the arms industry kept coming in, changing into civil servants, and going out again as arms manufacturers. Here's some examples. Sir Colin Chandler, knighted in 1988. In 1985, Sir Colin was marketing director of Britain's biggest arms company, British Aerospace. Then he went through the revolving door to become a neutral civil servant and head of Defence Export Sales Organisation at the Ministry of Defence. In 1988, he was through the door again, leaving the civil service for a key post in private industry, managing director of the arms company Vickers. Then there was Sir Peter Levine, knighted in 1989. In 1985, Sir Peter was managing director of the arms company United Scientific Holdings, when he followed Sir Colin Chandler through the revolving door to become a neutral civil servant and head of defence procurement in charge of all arms sales at the Ministry of Defence. In 1992, he took up a key post in property. What about Sir James Blythe, knighted in 1985? In 1981, Sir James was general manager of the arms company Lucas Aerospace, when he went through the revolving door to become a neutral civil servant and head of defence sales at the Ministry of Defence. In 1985, he was through the door again for a key post in private industry, the arms company Plessy, and later, into the bargain, onto the board of British Aerospace. Sir John Cuckney, knighted in 1978. For 11 years up to 1985, Sir John was chairman of International Military Services, a company wholly owned by the neutral Ministry of Defence. IMS's job was to sell arms abroad, and in 1985, Sir John left IMS and became chairman of the military helicopter company Westland and deputy chairman of the TI group, which made military equipment. Jonathan Aitken, MP, not yet knighted. In the 1970s, Mr. Aitken became an advisor and public relations man to the royal family in Saudi Arabia and helped them with many arms deals between the Saudis and the British government. In 1988, Aitken joined the board of B-Mark, a subsidiary of a big new arms company called Astra, which went bust in 1992. That same year, Aitken went through the revolving door to become the Minister of Defence Procurement in charge of all arms sales from Britain. Perhaps the most amazing story is about David Hastie. Mr. Hastie was Colin Chandler's successor as marketing director of Britain's biggest arms company, British Aerospace. In 1988, he went through the revolving door at the ministry to become a neutral civil servant whose main job was to sell the Hawk jet fighter manufactured by his former company. A wonderful opportunity for selling Hawk arose at the Great Baghdad Arms Fair, organised with tremendous pomp and ceremony by Saddam Hussein in April and May 1989. David Hasty's Ministry of Defence contract was specially extended to allow him to go to the fair, but there was a snag. There was still officially a British arms embargo on Iraq, so the Foreign Office insisted that Ministry of Defence officials couldn't go to the fair. So poor Mr. Hasty flew off to Baghdad thinking he was banned from the fair because he was a neutral civil servant. Then a very strange thing happened. On the tarmac of Baghdad airport, he suddenly changed his identity. Hey presto! He was miraculously seconded by the Ministry to British Aerospace. Now he could go to the fair because he wasn't a neutral Ministry of Defence official anymore, but a British Aerospace man again. And once back from the fair, he turned once again into a neutral civil servant. And a few months later, he was through the revolving door and out into a key post in private industry with his old boss, Sir Colin Chandler at Vickers. There hadn't been anything like it since Prince Charming and the Pumpkin. Most people assume that the ministries of government are made up of men and women who have no commercial interest, who are dispassionate and objective when it comes to commercial questions, and who hold the ring fairly for the British people. After the Scott inquiry, no one can be quite sure who runs the country, or who runs the arms companies, or whether the same people do both.
Problems?
That bloody idiot Saddam.
Oh, I thought everything had smoothed over since the ceasefire.
So did I. But it turns out he's been gassing his own people.
That serious?
Well, it is if you're a Kurd.
Is it serious for us here in Britain? People massacre their own people all the time. You know? Just look at Africa.
Africans are different. They're not important. They don't buy arms. You remember that last set of guidelines we came up with? Well, obviously, they were drawn up when there was a war on. Well, now there's a ceasefire. I mean, it's a terribly attractive market to get into. Two war-damaged countries with both armies massively depleted. We would be foolish not to get involved.
No, I agree. I mean, we could hardly afford our own armed forces if it wasn't for foreign arms sales.
But to do that, we need new guidelines. Something that says, hey, who cares? Now it's over, we can sell arms to whomever we like. While at the same time reassuring the public that nothing has changed and that we are still holding fast against sales.
Yeah, I see the problem.
Oh, no. No, it isn't a problem. You see, we're getting rather good at circumventing the truth. No. We've just changed the existing guidelines to read, we should not approve orders in future for any defence equipment which, in our view, would be of direct and significant assistance to either country in the conduct of offensive operations.
I like that. Strict, rigid, firm, means bugger all. You can interpret it to mean what you like.
Well, that's what we think. But now we've got cold feet. Well, you see, a change is a change, whichever way you look at it. And if there has been a change, people are going to notice, they're going to want to know why, they're going to comment, and now that silly bastard has started gassing people. Well, it does look a bit suspect to be encouraging exports.
Oh, that's all right. Don't tell anyone you've changed the guidelines. Use the new ones in private. Pretend they don't exist. No one will ever know.
And continue to use the old guidelines in public. I mean, very tough, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, in private, we'll tell the arms manufacturers they can pretty well do what they like and sell to anyone they like, except Iran. No, we're a bit worried there, especially after that Ayatollah and Salman Rushdie business. But now that Saddam, you see, has lost his marbles, well, people are starting to take notice and ask where he gets his arms from. Now there's a chance of us being rumbled.
Oh, I don't know. Who's actually involved?
The government, us, the arms manufacturers.
And who out of that lot is going to spill the beans, eh? You're all in it together. Look, provided no one says anything and you close ranks, you're fine.
Yes, but is that being responsible?
You're a civil servant. Your responsibilities of the ministry you work for. How can you be held to be publicly responsible as well? That'd be too much.
But what if it does get out?
Do you really think the government would be foolish enough to let something as incriminating as this actually slip out?
That was me getting all worked up about it.
The old Guideline 3 was meant to prevent arms exports which would prolong or exacerbate the conflict. The new Guideline 3 was weaker, simply referring to the conduct of offensive operations. This new guideline was in place by the end of 1988, but not openly, effectively allowing more arms exports to Iran and Iraq. But in February 1989, Iran issued a fatwa against a British citizen, the writer Salman Rushdie. Arms sales to Iran had to be cut back. In effect, subsequent interpretation of the new guideline therefore tilted towards Iraq. But was it a policy change? Whatever it was not announced to the public or indeed to Parliament. Quite the opposite. Although it was an operation from 1988 onwards, it was not acknowledged. In fact, it was denied. From 1988 until April 1994, there were no less than 24 different occasions on which ministers, either in the Houses of Parliament or in written answers or in letters, gave false or inaccurate information about the guidelines. On the 20th of April 1989, Lord Glenarthur told the House of Lords that
exports to Iran and Iraq are covered by very strict guidelines and scrutinized rigorously.
On the same day, even though he had been involved in secret changes to the guidelines 4 months earlier, Arms Minister Alan Clark was still assuring MPs that
applications for such licenses are examined against the guidelines on the export of defence equipment set out by the Foreign Secretary Sir Geoffrey Howe in 1985 in accordance with stringent export control procedures.
The following month, May 1989, William Waldegrave, Minister of State at the Foreign Office, told Parliament
the government have not changed their policy on defence sales to Iraq.
And there was Jonathan Aitken, the Minister for Defence Procurement. In May 1992, he told the Commons,
since 1984, the United Kingdom has refused to supply any equipment which could prolong or exacerbate the Iran-Iraq conflict.
But in 1988, that guideline, as we have just seen, had been entirely changed. Jonathan Aitken had a stout defender in the Prime Minister, John Major, who insisted in an answer to then Labour leader John Smith in the Commons in November 1992,
the suggestion that ministers misled is a serious charge and scurrilous charge and has no basis whatsoever in fact.
To show that Parliament had not been misled, William Waldegrave claimed the guidelines had not been changed because any such change needed approval from the Prime Minister, and he had never sought such approval. At the inquiry, this is how Alan Clark described William Waldegrave's train of thought.
Well, you see, one is now back to the slightly Alice in Wonderland suggestion, where my former colleague, Mr. Waldegrave, said because something was not announced, it had not happened. A sort of Berkeleyan philosophy.
Scott and Baxendale were not impressed by Mr. Waldegrave's claim that all that had changed was an interpretation of policy.
What you're saying is that if you cannot announce a policy change, you cannot have that policy change?
Yes, I believe that to be right.
You cannot have a flexible interpretation to amount to a change, can you, and thereby avoid the announcement?
Well, I mean, that's what all this argument, I guess, is going to be about.
On the 21st of December, everyone is agreeing that whatever is decided needs to go to the Secretaries of State and thence to the Prime Minister.
Well, if there was going to be a change of policy, absolutely.
I would like to move on to your letter 3 months later to Mr. Clark with a copy to Lord Trefgarne. What you have set out there is the exact words of the revised guidelines, is it not?
It is. And here my argument is that this was going to be usable as an interpretation. I think the word interpretation is rather important there.
How is it that these words in December needed to go up to the Secretaries of State, the Prime Minister, and an announcement in Parliament, and yet 3 months later don't seem to?
Well, what requires going to the Prime Minister and etc., is actually formally changing the guidelines.
You're doing the same thing.
No, I argued not.
These are exactly the same words.
I think what has changed, and what must have changed during that period, is the Foreign Office's view as to whether this actually has a real effect on the outcome of the policy.
I must say I do not know any document that supports what you're saying.
Oh, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know that necessarily you would find that in a document.
Are you saying that the new wording was never used, Or are you saying that because the new wording did not go to the Secretary of State, the Prime Minister, and it was not announced, that the guidelines were never changed, even though the wording was used, or might have been used?
The guidelines could not be changed. Foreign Secretary's guidelines could not be changed, except by the Foreign Secretary and with permission and all that from Overseas and Defence. It is perfectly clear that the guidelines are never changed.
There's a problem about this which has been keeping me awake at night. The proposition, which seems to come from your paper, is that the guidelines were announced in 1985. The guidelines could not be changed without the proposal going to senior ministers, the Prime Minister, and being announced to Parliament. None of those things ever happened. Ergo, the guidelines were never changed.
I mean, to accept that as the only argument, I mean, you have to believe that Whitehall is basically honest. Which I do believe.
The basic honesty of Whitehall was demonstrated by the note sent in February 1989 from William Wardegrave's office to Sir Geoffrey Howe. Mr. Wardegrave is content for us to implement a more liberal policy on defence sales without any public announcement on the subject. The note also suggested that in the event of embarrassing questions in Parliament, an assurance would be given that the guidelines are being kept under constant review and are applied in the light of the ceasefire and developments in peace negotiations. Alan Clark's office replied, "We are pleased with your agreement to implement a more liberal policy without any public announcement." This agreement that policy had become more liberal is vital. If Guideline 3 was a policy change, then Parliament had to be told, and not to tell Parliament would clearly be deception. A string of witnesses continued to insist to Lord Justice Scott that there had been no change in policy. Lord Trefgarne, Minister of State for Defence from 1985 to 89, then for Trade until 1990.
Miss Baxendale referred to a more liberal policy, and I agree, that is what it says there. But in fact, we weren't changing the policy. We were instructing officials to interpret the policy more flexibly.
You didn't see it as implementing a more liberal policy. You saw it as a more flexible interpretation.
I did.
You saw it as implementing the same policy, but more flexible.
Correct. I'm concerned to ensure that you understand that the policy was not changed. What we decided upon was a more flexible interpretation of the policy, and if there are words in any of the documents that lead you to think otherwise, I would wish you to disregard them.
And it was the same story when the inquiry questioned David Gore-Booth, former head of the Foreign Office's Middle East Department.
How can something that is described as a flexible interpretation of guidelines also be referred to as being very rigorously implemented?
Because you have to break down the guidelines. You have no lethal equipment at the top. You have no equipment which will encourage the reignition of the war. If you actually look at the kit that was exported, you'll see it's in essence non-military. That seems to me to add up to vigorous implementation.
Do you have any difficulty with the juxtaposition, though, of those two phrases, or none at all?
Which two phrases?
What I was putting to you, something that is referred to as a flexible interpretation, having that side by side with also being a very rigorous implementation.
I don't see why you shouldn't have a rigorous implementation of a flexible interpretation. I don't have any difficulty with that at all.
Ministers were and are able to mislead Parliament. Highly skilled civil servants carefully craft their answers. Some of the most revealing evidence given to Scott came from the man in charge of these advisers, the head of the civil service, Sir Robin Butler. His questioning began with a general discussion on public servants' responsibilities to provide accurate parliamentary answers.
I would now like to go on to the answering of parliamentary questions. Can we take your statement? You say answers should be sufficiently full to avoid giving a misleading account of an issue. You can't give half an answer if the effect of giving half an answer, although the half answer may be strictly accurate, is to give a misleading impression.
There are certain circumstances in which it is justified to give half an answer, but you should try not to mislead, certainly.
The problem is, if you give half an answer, the recipient is likely to believe he's getting the full answer. You don't realize you're only getting half of it. Apart from the derogatory connotations of the word misleading, is the effect not exactly the same?
No, it is not.
You do not mislead. You give some information that you safely can. You do not give all the information that is available to you. By doing that, it does not follow that you mislead people. You just do not give the full information.
You are doing it in a calculated fashion so that they do not get the right impression.
No, you're not doing that at all. They get the right impression, which
They don't.
Yes, they do. They get the right impression.
They get a little of it. They get a third of the right impression and 2/3 not.
No. They get the right impression. Half the picture. Half the picture can be true. What I'm saying, I think, is that these are difficult lines to draw. It is not justified to mislead. But very often one is finding oneself in a position where it is necessary to give an answer that is not the whole truth, but falls short of misleading. These are difficult lines to draw.
Forgive me. Your case is not that it is always wrong to mislead. Your case is that sometimes you have to mislead?
Yes. My case is that only in the most exceptional circumstance should one mislead. But there is a wider category of cases where it is necessary to give an incomplete answer. But one should, in these circumstances, seek not to mislead. It can be incomplete, but not misleading.
Sir Robin Butler, remember, is the head of the civil service. He speaks for Whitehall. One of the civil servants who prepared answers and wrote letters was the desk officer for Iraq at the Foreign Office, Mark Higson. Part of your job was drafting misleading answers.
Yes, you drafted letters for replies to MPs and members of the public. And of course, you drafted them along the lines of the stated public policy.
Now, at the Scott inquiry, you told Sir Richard Scott that after the new Guideline 3 came in, you continued to churn out, as you put it, the old guideline. Why did you?
Well, two things. One, you were doing a job, and two, you needed that job. If I was in a position to actually challenge those guidelines, then I might have done so publicly, but that is not the case.
So you knew that the new Guideline 3 existed, but you were continuing to offer answers on the basis of the old guideline?
Yes, because officially any change in the guideline had not been announced.
So what is your view of William Waldegrave's insistence that there was no change in policy?
That's for Mr. Waldegrave to answer, not me.
Well, let me ask you then, would you consider the replacement of the old Guideline 3 with the new Guideline 3 as a change in policy?
Yes.
Is this regular Whitehall practice, or is this simply to do with this particular sequence of events, the export of arms to these two countries and then latterly the tilt towards Iraq, or is this customary throughout Whitehall and Westminster?
I don't think it's sort of a widespread, nasty bit of skullduggery.
I didn't ask you that.
No, all right.
Well, let me ask you, should we accept anything that a senior civil servant, or indeed a junior civil servant, or a senior or a junior government minister says at face value?
I don't think so, no.
Shouldn't we be told this a little more often?
Well, I think so, but there are a lot of people out there doing a straightforward job where there are no bits and bobs that are a little bit economical with the truth. And there are some that are doing it.
Is it possible to work in Whitehall and Westminster and do a straightforward job?
It would be nice to think so, wouldn't it?
And do you have high hopes of the Scott report?
I don't know where you place high hopes. I mean, I've got nothing personal about anyone that might be criticised. And they've only come across me as a small cog in a very big machine. But I have hopes, yes, that it might lead to rather more openness in government.
Maybe the whole picture?
Something towards that, yes.
Mark Hickson, thank you. There was one man in Whitehall back in 1989 who was horrified by what was going on and tried to do something about it. Some of the most riveting evidence given to Scott came from Lieutenant Colonel Richard Glazebrook. He provided Scott with an insight into how Britain is governed, with the commercial interests of a handful of arms companies competing with the public interest. Glazebrook was one of the military advisors to a working group in the Ministry of Defence which vetted any suspicious applications for an export licence for British-made goods which might be in breach of the guidelines.
You say that you understand that you were believed to adopt a more rigorous approach than some.
It built up over the years, if you like. About a year after I took up my appointment, that would make it about 1986, a representative of Marconi said to me, "I hope you'll forgive me, but I understand that you take a stricter attitude than some of the people in the MOD to export sales. Defence Export Services Secretariat called us at one stage the branch that likes to say no."
You say they use the narrowest interpretations of lethal and significant when presenting their cases. What do you mean by that?
A very good example of that is spares for tanks. They argued that guns on the tanks were definitely lethal. By a stretch, the sights that aimed the guns could be lethal, but that the motors for tanks and the tracks on tanks were not lethal. They were merely something to drive the vehicle around the desert.
That was the argument?
That was the argument, sir.
History was to vindicate Glazebrook. One of the battles he fought was to attempt to prevent a sophisticated piece of radio equipment from being exported to Iraq. Soon after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Glazebrook went to an MOD meeting. Baxendale took him through his notes of the meeting.
You have put, "Oh, bloody hell." That's the radio equipment, isn't it?
Yes.
Why did you write that? Whose words were they?
No, those were the words of a Royal Signals officer who came to see me after the invasion of Kuwait to check up on what equipment had been supplied to Iraq over the years, in case the British Army had to take military operations against them. And on being told that they'd been equipped with a certain amount of this equipment, he said, "Oh, bloody hell, we have nothing to touch that." I reported this to the meeting, rubbing salt in the wound, if you like, that I had been opposing this all the time.
Another thing which worried Glazebrook was his belief that arms for Iraq were being funneled through Jordan.
What were the grounds for that belief?
The best word to use is accumulative. Over the years, the various advice I'd received from Defence Intelligence that stuff was moving from Jordan to Iraq.
Was it your view at the time that Jordan should have been included within the terms of the guidelines?
We, myself and Defence Intelligence, proposed on a number of occasions that we should look at exports to Jordan under the terms of the guidelines. However, this was turned down on the basis that the guidelines were specifically to be applied to Iran and Iraq and to no one else.
Right, come on, Dennis, come on, onto me. You haven't seen those because I haven't shown them to you. And anyway, it's all on a need-to-know basis. But you didn't need to know that, did you, Dennis? Right, well, I know what I need, and that's one of these. Whoa! A few more of those, and it might just make sense. Now, tonight, viewers, I thought I'd show you how to make rather a lot of bread. That's this stuff here. No, come on, don't back off, Dennis. It's no use saying you don't want to get your hands dirty, because if you don't do it, somebody else jolly well will. You see, that's how you get French bread. And this is how you get Santé. Right, first, catch your arms contract. Nice juicy one from a country that's either about to go to war or already at war and is desperate to replenish its supplies. Then you need to prepare your arms, and I've chosen this rather tasty piece of radio equipment. Very sophisticated, well, at least by British standards. But remember, you can't export this as it stands because it's restricted. So what you do, Dennis, is you chop your radio into nice, small pieces. There we are. Nice, safe, honest machine parts could be used for anything. Now, you want to make sure they get to Iraq, so you pop them into a nice, warm Jordan. There we go, nice country Jordan. Hello, Your Highness, if you're watching. And hey presto, it finds its way into Iraq, from where we get our bread. There we go. Right, that's all so straightforward, even an idiot could do it, as you've just seen. Right, but you might find a slight problem with the guidelines on arms exports. What are they, I hear you ask? Well, that rather depends on who you are. But like all the best recipes, Dennis, you can just adapt them as the mood takes you. And if anyone wants to know what the recipe is, you say, it's one of Alan Clark's. And I don't think you really need to know. Cheers.
It wasn't only conventional weapons which were reaching Iran and Iraq via other countries like Jordan. Nuclear, chemical and biological weapons were also getting through. By 1988, civil servants were so concerned about this that they had begun to draft a list of countries of concern. When Margaret Thatcher visited Jordan in 1990, Jordan was on that list.
Were you aware of concerns about Jordan being used as a diversionary route for equipment to get to Iraq?
In August 1990, when I saw the King of Jordan, there were many matters to discuss with him. One being that he was on the side of Iraq, which to us was horrific. I tackled him about evidence that goods which had been supplied to Jordan were in fact being diverted to Iraq. He was very, very taken aback indeed. I do not know whether he knew or whether he didn't, and eventually I said to him, as he denied it, "Well then, will you give me your personal assurance that these goods will not be diverted?" Immediately he came back and said, "I give you my personal assurance." How far can one rely on that? To destabilize Jordan would have been a very, very serious matter indeed. So we took the course of doing as much as we could and seeking what, for the king, was unusual, to give a personal assurance.
The year after that meeting, a revised list of countries of concern was sent to the Prime Minister. The man who drew up the list was civil servant Peter Vereker, head of arms control and disarmament at the Foreign Office.
Then you have the list. And if you look, there's a gap, isn't there?
Yes.
Where Jordan should be. You can see it's alphabetical. It looks as though someone's just snow-paked it out, or it's just gone, hasn't it?
That's a gap.
The gap is the omission of Jordan. That's plain, isn't it?
It seems likely. I don't know.
It's obvious if you have an alphabetical list and there's a gap at J.
I'm going through my mind if there are some other J's.
Mr. Vereker, are you seriously telling me that your response to the question whether the gap shows that Jordan has been removed is only that it seems likely?
I don't know the answer, but I think it's very likely.
It's certain, isn't it?
I hadn't even noticed the gap before.
You hadn't noticed? You mean you hadn't noticed that Jordan wasn't on it, or you mean you hadn't noticed the gap?
Of course I knew that Jordan wasn't on it. I hadn't noticed the gap.
I keep trying to think of other countries beginning with J, and all I can think of is Jersey. I was going to ask you, at the top of this document, there's some handwriting. It says, "Mr. Haswell, Jordan has disappeared. Well done."
Charles Haswell was the Foreign Office official in the Near East and Africa Department responsible for maintaining good relations with Jordan.
So now the tension is visibly mounting amongst those who have featured or are about to feature in the all-singing, all-dancing, all-need-to-know production of Scott of the Arms Antics. So far, so what? Remember, we're looking at 3 sorts of deception: grave, very grave, and Waldegrave. The nominations for best supporting role in a government fiasco are Geoffrey Howe, for failing to announce the guidelines or the relaxation, not so much Silence of the Lambs as the dead sheep. Lord Glenarthur, for his inaccurate answer to the House of Lords. Alan Clark, for giving a misleading answer to the House of Commons, and others too numerous to mention. William Waldegrave, Lord Trefgarne, Jonathan Aitken, William Waldegrave, again, David Gore-Booth, though that's a rigorous implementation of a flexible interpretation, and Sir Robin Butler. I said I wouldn't mention them, but I was lying. See, it's contagious. Now, there was to be an award for Peter Vereker, but there seems to be a gap under V where his name should be, so we'll send the award to Jordan, and I'm sure it'll reach him. Sheena.
The But why were the secret and secretive ways of Whitehall ever exposed to public scrutiny? Why was it necessary for the Prime Minister to give Sir Richard Scott the power to cross-examine in public the men and women who formulated the secrets and kept them? The answer is that in 1990, the Arms for Iraq scandal began to leak out.
Sheffield, a throbbing city, a vital city, a city working to make the goods that people round the world will buy. Rail track for the colonies, cutlery for the Americas, spun wire for Australia, and a huge, entirely harmless hardened steel tube for Iraq. Yes, everywhere in modern Britain, enterprise takes her rightful place. The mighty vessel bound for Iraq, the toiling dock workers making sure everything is in order, and there alongside, customs men, going quietly about their daily business, ripping open the packaging on the pipes, discovering they are part of a giant illegal arms shipment that the British government knew about all along. And as we look on with pride, the other nations of the world must surely reflect on how we in Britain still set the example they might follow.
A week after the discovery of the so-called supergun, Trade and Industry Minister Sir Nicholas Ridley was on his feet in the House of Commons congratulating Customs and Excise on their heroic work and assuring MPs that the government only
recently became aware, in general terms, of an Iraqi project to develop a long-range gun based on designs developed by the late Dr. Gerald Bull.
There was only one problem with Sir Nicholas Ridley's statement. It wasn't true. Years before, the makers of the gun, Walter Summers, had told the government that they suspected the tubes they were making for the Iraqis were for a gun, an uncomfortable fact of which Ridley was reminded by the Tory MP for Bromsgrove, Sir Hal Miller.
As I personally, over 2 years ago, made to his department and the Ministry of Defence, and I believe a third agency, an offer by Walter Summers to withdraw from the contract or to meet the contract and enable it to be traced, or just to carry on with the contract. And as this offer was repeated 12 months later by myself, does my right honourable friend share my surprise that there can be any question of prosecuting the company for any contravention of regulation or lack of good faith in the matter?
Confronted with Miller's incontrovertible evidence, ministers tried to dissuade him from using this evidence in court. Miller told Scott of what he felt was a threatening encounter with the Attorney General, Sir Patrick Mayhew.
Who made an effort to stop you producing the evidence in court? You said someone made an effort to stop you going to court.
He sought to dissuade me from producing the evidence in court.
He being?
Paddy Mayhew. He said, "You wouldn't do that, would you?" To which I replied, "Just watch me."
This account was strongly denied by Sir Patrick Mayhew in his prepared statements to the inquiry.
I never attempted, as he alleges, to persuade him not to go into court and produce documents. I'm sure that I did not say anything to convey pressure on him not to do so. It would be inconceivable to me, both as a private person and as a member of the bar, let alone its leader, the Attorney General. I have never done such a thing. If I had done so, it would remain vividly in my memory, I'm sure. Yet I recall no such action.
One action Sir Patrick did recall was his role in the decision not to prosecute the companies which made the supergun. Scott heard that Mayhew's senior government lawyers were very doubtful if a prosecution would succeed, and that when Sir Brian Unwin, the head of Customs and Excise, went to see Mayhew to persuade him to press ahead with the prosecutions, he came away empty-handed.
Did you feel at the end of the meeting that you could continue, as you wished to do, to take into account the wider public interest considerations?
I was pretty well convinced that we'd come to the end of the road on this case and the prosecution had to be dropped, in the light of the very firm views expressed by the Attorney General. But what I did was to take a very deep breath for a day or two and reflect on it before making a final decision on this case. When I left that meeting with the attorney, I was fairly convinced that we had not to go forward with the prosecution.
To the fury of Customs and Excise, the supergun prosecution was dropped, though Sir Patrick Mayhew insisted to Scott that he was not trying to protect his political colleagues. But Sir Brian Unwin eventually succeeded in bringing a prosecution against men he clearly saw as criminally guilty of arms export offences. That case ultimately led to the Scott inquiry. The prosecution by Customs and Excise of 3 executives from the Matrix Churchill Arms Company threatened the defendants with prison sentences. But the Matrix Churchill prosecution started to unravel in December 1990 when the Sunday Times reported that Trade Minister Alan Clark had advised Matrix Churchill how to draft their export licence applications.
Here was that dramatic headline in the Sunday Times.
Minister helped British firms to arm Saddam.
The headline was bad enough. The story below was terrible.
A government minister and high-ranking civil servants have helped British firms to export equipment for military purposes to Iraq. Exports of military goods to Iraq have been embargoed by the British government since 1984.
The minister was Alan Clark. The story revolved around a meeting he called in his office at the Department of Trade in 1988, and the Sunday Times had the minutes.
The minutes revealed that, in an unusual move for a government minister, Clark gave those present some helpful hints on how to fill in their licence applications, apparently to minimise the chance of their exports being blocked by the embargo.
Mr. Clark advised as follows.
The intended use of the machines should be couched in such a manner as to emphasise the peaceful aspect to which they will be put. Application should stress the record of general engineering usage of machine tools.
What did all this mean? The Sunday Times had spoken to 2 people at the meeting.
Both say Clark left them in no doubt that the government was prepared to allow the export of machine tools, even if they did end up producing shells for the Iraqi army. Everybody knew the machines could make shells, one said. The minister was giving us a nod and a wink.
A nod and a wink from the minister to break his government's own regulations? Impossible, surely. All that Sunday there was panic at Downing Street. Was the story true? And if so, what could the brand new Prime Minister, John Major, do about it? Prompt at 8:30 the next morning, December 3rd, a group of unbelievably important people packed into the office of Sir Robin Butler, Secretary to the Cabinet and head of the entire British Civil Service. Who was there? Sir Brian Unwin was there. He was Chairman of Customs and Excise, elected by no one. Sir Peter Gregson was there. He was the top man at the Department of Trade and Industry, elected by no one. Gerald Hosker was there. He was the top lawyer at the Department of Trade and Industry, elected by no one. Sir Michael Quinlan, KCB, was there. He was top man at the Ministry of Defence, elected by no one. David Gore-Booth, CMG, was there. He was Assistant Under Secretary at the Foreign Office in charge of the Middle East, elected by no one. And, of course, Sir Robin Butler was there, elected by no one. His secretary took notes, which were, eventually, disclosed to the Scott inquiry. At once, the meeting learned the awful truth. The Sunday Times story was completely true. Sir Peter Gregson had the minutes of that 1988 Clark meeting. He announced, to everyone's horror,
"The official record encourages the nod and wink people."
The official record backed the Sunday Times story. So what was to be done? Sir Peter had a suggestion.
We would need to brazen beyond that.
Brazen? What could he mean? The answer came that very afternoon, after more frantic discussions at Downing Street. The Parliamentary Under Secretary at the Department of Trade, Mr. Tim Sainsbury, rose in the House of Commons to announce,
"My honourable friend strongly denies the interpretation put on the remarks alleged to have been made by him in the Sunday Times article."
His honourable friend, Alan Clark, who was sitting next to him, strongly denied the Sunday Times story. But 2 years later, in 1992, when the Matrix Churchill case came to court, he gave evidence on oath that the Sunday Times story was true, and that he had been, in his own immortal phrase,
economical with the actualité.
So the Sunday Times story was true. Elected ministers told the House of Commons it wasn't true after a meeting of very important, unelected people, a meeting which, if it hadn't been for the Scott inquiry, none of us would have known anything about.
The same afternoon, on December the 3rd, 1990, Alan Clark was summoned to another meeting, this time with the newly appointed Prime Minister John Major. The Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robin Butler, took the minutes. A copy of these was sent to Alan Clark, on which he made a number of amendments. For some reason, this copy of the minutes was not at first given to Scott.
Do you know why we were not sent this document originally?
I didn't know that you hadn't been sent it, and I know of no reason why you shouldn't have been. Can I assure you with absolute conviction that I know of no deliberate effort to keep it from you?
If we look at the document, Mr. Clark has crossed out the bit that says, so that they could not be used for military purposes, and now it just says, so that they would not be seen as suitable for military purposes.
What he was adding was that it was not only the fact that they had been downgraded, but that it should be visible that they had been downgraded.
There's no reason to believe, is there, that Customs and Excise were aware of the existence of these records of the conversation between Mr. Clark and the Prime Minister?
Not specifically those.
You don't have to be a lawyer to know that the note of the meeting between Mr. Clark and the Prime Minister would be relevant.
With respect, I rather think you do. I have no knowledge at all about what papers are necessarily admissible in legal proceedings. That is a matter for the prosecution and the defense.
I thought we were talking about relevance.
It is relevant, yes. It's relevant to the issue, certainly. There are lots of papers that are relevant to the issue.
Relevant they may have been, but no one told the QC in charge of the Matrix Churchill prosecution, Alan Moses, about this crucial document. He pressed ahead of the case because he had been led to believe that the nod and wink story was untrue. When questioned by Baxendale, he insisted that he should have been told.
I would like to go on to the meeting that Mr. Clark had with the Prime Minister on the 3rd of December, 1990, following the Sunday Times article. Do you think you should have been aware of that meeting?
I should have been told about this at the beginning of the case. If there was any truth in it, the case should have been stopped. The importance is the actual fact of being able to see the amendment. It is the bothering to change it that would concern me.
From the start, the government was worried that the Customs and Excise prosecution of Matrix Churchill would reveal the government's secrets on arms to Iraq. Plans to limit the damage were laid at yet another meeting in the office of the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robin Butler, this time with Sir Peter Gregson, the permanent Secretary at the Department of Trade and Industry. A few days later, Customs Chairman Sir Brian Unwin received a phone call.
I would like now to go to a note of a telephone conversation you had with Sir Robin Butler on the 17th of November 1990. He referred to reported remarks by Mr. Clark and said when I saw them I would realise there was an important public interest element to the case. The purpose of ringing me was to alert me to this interest and to express the hope that at whatever stage it was appropriate we would consult with DTI on the public interest dimension. What did you understand the conversation to be about?
I didn't entirely know. It's not very often the Cabinet Secretary rings the Chairman of Customs about individual cases.
Had it ever happened before?
I can't recall it ever happening before.
Sir Brian Unwin did not know that Sir Robin Butler had worked out a strategy to prevent embarrassing information from coming out in court without getting into the kind of row that followed the Supergun affair.
How's that arms trial of yours going?
Pretty good, actually. We think we've finally found a way to avoid it turning into an embarrassment.
Really? Found a legitimate way of making the prosecution stick?
No, good God, no. We're civil servants, not miracle workers. No, we've decided to encourage all the chaps at the DTI to avoid inconsistencies in their statements at all costs.
With each other?
With each other, with whatever account the government would like to come up with anything, in fact.
But surely to ensure that, you'd have to have somebody right at the top vetting absolutely everything they write.
I know. It's a remarkable achievement, isn't it?
So that means Sir Peter Gregson must be twisting arms to get his chaps at DTI to say what's needed.
Yes.
Yeah. Customs, won't you have a little bit of a problem there?
No. Sir Robin Butler is on the case. He can be very persuasive.
can he?
Oh, yes. Yeah, he was on the phone to the head of Customs and Excise when I left, telling him what to do. Sir Robin can be enormously kind-hearted like that, taking the time to help.
Is that entirely the correct form? The Cabinet Secretary phoning Customs and Excise, telling them what to do?
Well, yes, it's quite normal. I mean, he's never done it before, but that aside, it's perfectly normal.
Oh. What was he asking?
Oh, I couldn't possibly tell you that.
No, of course.
On the other hand, were you to ask me if he was asking him to consider the special public interest aspect of the case?
Which, of course, I would be most likely to ask.
Then I would have to say, yes, that's absolutely what he was asking.
And is there a public interest aspect in the case?
Yes. Not that Sir Robin told Sir Brian that. I mean, far too risky, one department knowing what the other one is up to. I mean, one may have open government, but it hardly needs to be that open. No, all Sir Brian needed to know was that he will be shown all the statements, and when reading them, he should consider the special public interest aspect.
Sir Robin really can be persuasive, can't he?
Yes, hopefully. He seems to have something in him that says, trust me on this one.
Yes, as opposed to trust me on this one because I'm sitting on a time bomb here with this doctored evidence which you don't know about, and if it gets out, then there'll be a hell of a mess and we'll all go down together. Yes. It's not usually the way people use the word trust, is it?
Unless they're in government.
Oh, unless they're in government.
Butler and Gregson agreed that Department of Trade and Industry lawyers would check all information before it was given to Customs.